I would like to present another Carey School alumni in her Panther Points of Pride video.
Hi, I'm June Taylor Payne Faddis, and I graduated from Carey High School in 1959. My parents were Alan Opal Taylor, and one place we lived was just off of Main Street in a little house that Adamson's owned. Then my dad bought this house that a Draper family had owned, and it had 10 acres of property, but it was about a block or a block and a half from the high school, so it really wasn't farm country. But it had 10 acres of hay, and I had a horse, and I'd ride my horse through that hay, and I had a Cocker Spaniel dog that had these floppy long ears, and the alfalfa was taller than he was, and he'd bound through the alfalfa, and his ears flopping around, but we'd ride up Fish Creek and different places like that. My dad at one time, when I was real little, ran the Hot Springs Ranch. It wasn't for too long, I don't think, because then we moved to southern Idaho. I was born in Dillon, Montana, but when I was about 3, my folks moved down to Carey, and my dad moved in and out of Carey quite a bit, but I did end up in Burley to start first grade, and I went to Ketchum School, to Gooding Grade School. I was in Mrs. Billingsley's class when I was in the 4th grade, and you know that 4th grade class was really fun because they had used these old one-room school buildings that lay out in the farm areas and brought them all in, and that was the grade school. And that building had a little stage in it, and I remember that we put on a play called The Blue Willow Plate, and Phyllis Judy was the star, and I remember Heber Kirkland was in it too, and that's how I learned what the figures on the Blue Willow plates, what they meant. But we had so much fun with that. I remember being on the stage, but I have no clue as to what I was doing. I can remember what other people were doing, but I can't remember what I was doing. And then 6th grade, I was in Beth Patterson's class in another one of those one-room schoolhouses, actually, that had been divided in 2. And then after that, we moved over to the basement of the old high school, and that was the 7th grade. And I remember that long hallway that led to the lunchroom. And at one time, I worked in the lunchroom, and that was always really fun because you could set all the good things underneath the the counter, so you make sure you got some of them. But I earned about $10 or $11 a month besides getting free lunches, and it was enough to buy a Jansen sweater. And for those of you who remember, Jansen sweaters were the brand name of sweater that everybody liked, but they were pretty expensive. But I really enjoyed that, and the food was so good. My mom worked there, and I remember her bringing great big tubs of flour home, and she would mix up bread dough and take it over early in the morning to make hot rolls, and those hot rolls were really, really good. Some of the things I remember most about living there was probably, well, as far as school was concerned, the dances. We danced in the gymnasium to a jukebox, and that was always lots of fun. And I remember Phyllis, Judy, and I one time, Mark Patterson was the principal, and we were out Fish Creek to an end of school party, and some high school boys drove up in a convertible, and you never saw Phyllis and I anymore. We were gone with the boys. And my dad, when he found out about that, he was so mad, and he called Mark Patterson up, and he really read him the riot act, and it really wasn't his fault. It was his sweet daughter that did that. Anyway, Phyllis and I got suspended from school for doing that, but it just happened. It was the end of the school year, so we wouldn't have gone back to school anyway. We'd skate on Carey Lake, and then we'd go out to the Payne Ranch where the water had flooded, and just skated on that flooded part, and that was always really fun. I really liked that. We had lots of dances, and I went to a lot of movies. We always later got a kick out of the fact that the movie theater was in the church house. And anybody I tell that, they almost don't believe me. But my mother and I, we would go to the movie in Carey downtown, and I think it was $0.25 a piece or something like that. It wasn't very expensive. I had a best girlfriend that we started first grade in Burley together, and we have stayed friends. She lives in Pleasant Grove now, and there was times when there'd be years when I wouldn't communicate with her, but the friendship endured. And then when I found out that she was as close as she is, I thought that was pretty special. Some of the other kids that I ran around with was Barbara Barton, and I guess my best friend in high school was Lita Park. She was a year behind me, but we were really good friends. And Barbara and Lita and I, we thought we were authors. We wanted to write a book, and so we'd go home and we'd write our stories, and they were always love stories. And then we'd get together whenever we could, and we'd sit. I can remember sitting underneath a tree and reading our newest chapter that we had just written about our books. We were always writing our books. Oh, it was really silly, I guess, but anyway, we really enjoyed doing that. And I don't know, I was friends with all the kids. I remember Judy Pratt and Ann Peck. Ann was such a good jacks player. She always beat me playing jacks. And who else? Anyway, there were just lots of kids, and I hate leaving anybody's name out, but
other friends were Judy Peterson and Francie Bennett.
We had a lot of fun. We just really enjoyed ourselves. Going up to Sun Valley, Haley, to movies, down to Twin Falls sometimes for stake dances and things like that.
Another thing that was fun for me when I was in high school was to be in the student council as student body secretary 2 years in a row. Another fun thing that we did was Phyllis, Judy, and I went to Girls State.
I liked most of my teachers. There was only one teacher I didn't like, and I won't give you his name. I'm not sure he's even alive right now, but I really liked Kenneth Cook, because my favorite classes were speech and and doing the declamation contests and doing orations, and I can't believe I ever memorized what I've memorized back then, because my brain's gone to mush now. And then he had been on a mission to Samoa, and he brought home a lot of Polynesian type fabric, and he showed girls how to make the clothes that the Polynesian girls would wear. I can't remember the name for it right now, but at any rate, he taught us and the guys, he taught us some Samoan dances. And you know, when they'd have a golden green ball in other wards or the stakes or whatever, it got to the point where we were invited all over the county and over to Arco, and we went just every place doing those Polynesian sarong, that's the word, doing those dances, and that was just really fun. And we did a really good job on our declamation contests. I mean, we were a little school, but we'd go down like to Minico. I don't know if they have Minico still or not, but anyway, here were all these kids from big schools competing, but this was more of a one-on-one. It wasn't a team. Well, it wasn't a way, but it wasn't, you know, you weren't like on a football team or something. And we came home with really good scores. I mean, superior grades, most of us would come back with. And I remember one time I had been doing orations several times, and we had a different teacher. I don't know why, but anyway, there was this lady, and they decided I should do something different. And so she says, "June, I want you to do extemporaneous speaking." And I was scared to death because I had no idea. I took home every U.S. News and World Report and Newsweek magazine by the tons from the library, and I had to study everything that was in all those magazines because I had no idea what I would be asked. And so we got down there and I drew my subject, and it was, "What is Russia's giveaway program?" And I was clueless. So anyway, after talking with her a little bit, we decided that Russia didn't have a giveaway program, that they didn't give anything away. So anyway, I got through it, but I don't think I got as good a rating as I had on other things, but I was just scared to death to do that.
Some of my other teachers that were favorites were Ronald Peck. I had him in history and chorus. And there was one teacher that was there only for about a year. Her name was Miss Bryan, and I had her in typing and shorthand, and I really liked her because she wore these cute high heels.
Well, rode my horse, wrote my book, ran around with boyfriends. Fished with my dad. I'm an only child, so that might explain a lot of some of the things I did, but my dad liked to go fishing on the lakes and the dams, and I remember he bought me some trolling fishing equipment, and I like to troll. I don't like going in the bushes because I'm afraid of snakes, but I did like, you know, fishing on the lakes, Redfish Lake and the dams, Fish Creek and Wood River. I don't remember thinking about it. Well, for one thing, I got engaged to Lee Payne when I was Well, December of 1958, and I was going to graduate in 59, so my mind wasn't on what I wanted to be when I grew up. We had a wedding all planned for August, and then the military changed our plans.
I went down to Texas with Lee's folks to see him graduate from flight school and to receive his wings.
And while we were there, he told me that the military wanted him to be back east at a certain time. And so it was either get married now or wait for I don't know how many months. And so I called my mother from the officers club in Big Spring, Texas, and I said, Mom, we want to get married as soon as we get home. And my poor mother, she had to put a wedding together in 2 weeks. So anyway, it wasn't as fancy as they have them now, but the Relief Society took care of the decorations, and Barbara Peck made my cake and made a quick trip to Boise for a dress, and that was it. At our wedding reception, Lee got a phone call, and he said, because what had happened was when we were in Texas, we came home in his folks' car. So that meant he was without transportation to go back to Texas and pick up his stuff and head for Georgia. But he got a phone call at our reception, and they said, Lee, we'll pick you up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And he says, hey, I'm at my wedding reception. And so we drove down to Twin Falls that night, and the next morning, these guys drove by our little motel and picked him up, and he said goodbye of his wife of about 8 hours and and took off. And so I got in this car that had just married all over it and everything, and decided, well, I might as well go home. So I took off driving, and I got hungry, so I stopped at the Manhattan Cafe in Shoshone and got out to have something to eat, and here I am all by myself, car saying just married, all over it. And there's a bunch of guys in there who I guess were just having their coffee for the morning or whatever, and I don't know what they had to say about me when I left. But anyway, I drove back to Carey, and my mom and some family were taking all the presents out of the church house and taking them home, and I just went in and helped them. But anyway, until we were married on the 15th of May, and sometime in June, I was scheduled to fly back to Georgia. And Lee had sent me an airline ticket, and I had not been out of Idaho a lot. My folks had to take me to Twin Falls, and I got on a plane, and I flew from Twin Falls to Salt Lake and had to change airlines. And then I had to fly from Salt Lake to Chicago, O'Hare Airport, which was a disaster for a little girl from Idaho. And anyway, I had a lady that helped me, bless her heart. I swear she's one of those angels. But at any rate, then I had to fly from O'Hare to Atlanta, and then got on another airline and flew from Atlanta to Goldsboro, to Valdosta, Georgia. And I just had a perm before I left, and that humidity made my hair just stand out. Anyway, But we finally got back together, and after I was there, Lee had wanted me to go to school of some kind. And so I enrolled in a business school. So I would go to school during the day, and that worked out pretty good. And then he was assigned temporary duty to go around the country learning how to fly B-52s. And we went back to Carey. I stayed in Carey while he was in Texas, or not in Texas, in Nevada, for survival training. And then we went to Castle Air Force Base that was just outside of Merced, California. And then from there, we went to Roswell, New Mexico. Now, by this time, I was expecting our first baby. I had no idea where that baby was going to be born. But we got to Roswell, and that's where we met the crew that would become really good friends for me. And I ended up having my first baby, Jeff. And then we made a quick stop after that in Wichita, Kansas. And then we finally got to our destination, which was Goldsboro, North Carolina. Well, 2 days before we got to Goldsboro, the warehouse that all of our things were in burned down. And it was all our wedding presents and all my clothes, because I knew I wouldn't be wearing regular clothes for a while. So all my clothes and anyway. So anyway, with the money that we got, we went and bought furniture, which we needed. It wasn't that big of a disaster, and I had learned to sew. I figured if I was a pain, I had to know how to sew, which didn't last long. But Lee was really busy. He wasn't home a whole lot. He flew. Sometimes he'd come home and he'd say, well, we flew over Spain, or I saw the aurora borealis this morning, or last night, or whatever. I mean, he flew all over. But a lot of what he did was top secret, so I really didn't know. Then every so often he would be required, he and the crew would be required to go on what they called alert. They'd go on alert in what they called the mole hole. And it was a place dug down in the kind of a basement type area on the base. And the men would stay there in anticipation of a possible attack. And they had to be ready and able to get to those planes in 12 minutes and take off. The planes were in the form of a Christmas tree, this way. And then one would take off, and then the other, then the other, then the other. And we could go out at night and visit them, and they would come out, and we'd sit at picnic tables and talk and discuss, and then on the 14th of October, 1961, he and his crew were assigned to participate in a simulated war maneuver, which was called Sky Shield 2. Now, this was just one of many Sky Shield operations, but it was called Sky Shield 2. And it can be looked up on the internet, and you can read all about it. But at any rate, the planes were to leave Air Force bases all around that surrounded the United States and take off and go out over the ocean with the idea of coming in under the radar barrier of the United States to see if they could be detected. Well, all commercial airlines were stopped around the United States, if you can imagine. All commercial airlines were stopped. And so all these planes from all over were doing the same type of thing. Tracy Perry contacted me once, and he said that he was in the Air Force up around Canada, and he was aware of it. But it was quite an operation, and even some British planes took part in it. And that night, or that day, during the day, well, I had gone out to watch them take off. It was just starting to be dawn. And watching those planes take off and go up, and I had Jeff with me, and other wives were out there. But I got really emotional, and I had to step away from all the other women. And anyway, it was really something watching those planes take off, just one right after another. I can't remember how many planes from this particular Seymour Johnson Air Force Base there was. But I went home that day, and I remember washing dishes.
I had a very strong feeling that if something happened to Lee, that I should just go back to Provo.
And anyway, that night I had a meeting over in another community, and it was raining. And coming back, there was a nursery on the base that would take care of children, and I had left Jeff there, and usually Lee would pick him up if he got back before I did. But I went to pick Jeff up, and he was there. So we went home, and these odd hours weren't uncommon to me. I was used to it. And I went to bed, and about 3 in the morning the doorbell rang, and it was still raining outside, and there were 2 or 3 men there, standing there. One man that they felt I knew, which I knew of him, but I really didn't know him. And then there was the base commander, and I knew immediately when I saw the base commander that what was up. And so I had let him come in, and they just told me that Lee's plane was missing. That's all they said. And they asked me if there was somebody they could have come and stay with me. And I said, no, my church will take care of me, which I had a neighbor next door to me that came over, and we sat and we had some deep discussions. But anyway, that was the 15th of November, or October, and by the 1st of November they had decided that there was no chance of those men surviving, which that didn't ring true many years later. It just didn't, well, I don't know. Anyway, but they said they were searching to the point where they were afraid that the planes were going to get in touch, they're going to crash into each other practically. So anyway, they sent me home, or gave me an airline ticket to fly back, to Boise. And in the meantime, Lee's folks and my dad and his new wife, Clara, And Lee's little brother, Dick, had driven clear from Carey all the way to Goldsboro, which is on the coast. And my dad ended up driving the whole way, and I just admired him for doing that. They stopped one night and nobody could sleep, in the motel, but so they all got up and took off again. Well, when the Air Force arranged for movers to come and pack up all my stuff, and Roy and Dick drove my car back, and here's Roy, whose probably biggest trip was maybe a trip to Ogden, or I don't know what his ability was, but he wasn't used to some of those big cities back there. And my dad said we lost him in Washington, D.C., but they got home. He and Dick got home, and that was fine. And Leola flew with me, and a lot of it's just a blank, I can't remember a whole lot of it. But after I got back to Boise, I went back and lived with, or stayed, I should say. Lived wasn't quite right. I stayed with Roy and Leola. And at that time, I had just barely found out that I was expecting another baby. And it would have made more sense for me to have stayed there and had that baby and everything, but there was something just pushing me to go to Provo, to BYU. And my mom quit her job in Boise, and she decided that she would go with me. And so we moved down to Provo in January, if you can believe it. Here I was pregnant. And rented a house. And then I still wasn't satisfied, so I decided I wanted to buy a house. My mother says, "You're like an old rabbit pulling her fur." But anyway, I found a house that I wanted to buy, and so we all got moved in, and my furniture was already back there in Provo, because that's where I'd told them to take it. And anyway, eventually I had Dan, and he was born in Provo. In an hour and 12 minutes, start to finish. He was a speedy little rascal. And then after he got, I don't know how old he was, but I enrolled in classes for summer school at BYU. And my next door neighbor took care of both he and Jeff. And Peg and Steve were there, and we exchanged babysitting. And I took quite a few classes. And the newspaper there, I had lived next to a fellow who was a writer for the newspaper, and he had seen he knew me, so he put an article in the newspaper about people starting over. Anyway, President Wilkinson from BYU saw that article, and he was really interested in it. Anyway, he wrote me the nicest letter, and told me if I ever got a chance just to come up and see him, like nobody else was.
Like he had all the time in the world.
And so anyway, I took as many classes as I could, and then later I was still taking classes from time to time. And that's when I met my second husband. Good old BYU, and he was somewhat older than I was, but he was just more than happy to inherit a family. And because Dan had never known his father, then Dale, my second husband, that's been his dad, and that worked out well. Lee and I were only married about 2.5 years. But anyway, after Dell and I were married, after he graduated, he was still just ready to graduate, he would work for different universities. He worked for the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. We went up and he worked for Rix up in Rexburg. We came down to Salt Lake again to work on a doctorate. Then he went up to Utah State and worked for Utah State University. And then from that we went up to Wenatchee, Washington, and he worked for the Washington State University. And we stayed there. That's where our kids all went to school and graduated. And when our youngest not finally gotten married, but after she'd gotten married, our folks needed help down in Utah, his mother and dad and my mother. And so we decided we would move back to Utah. And, let me back up a little bit. While we were in Wenatchee, Dell went on sabbatical leave. And I stayed with my mom in Payson. And I was taking my daughter clothes shopping for school, and just happened to go into this one store that I thought was a really nice store, but it had been turned into a tuxedo shop and a travel school. And as luck would have it, I'd locked the keys in my car. So while I was waiting for the police to come to let me in my car, I investigated that travel school. And so anyway, I decided that I would go to that travel school. So after Dell got off of his sabbatical and everything, he took all the kids and went back to Washington, and I just stayed in Utah and completed that travel training. And then I drove back to Washington, and then after all the kids had gone, we moved back down to Utah, and I was able to get a job right away working for Murdoch Travel. And of course at that time Murdoch was doing all the travel for the missionaries and the general authorities. And while I was working, I worked in Provo first, and then I came down to Salt Lake and worked in their office there. But I had a fellow ask me if I would like to work with a woman that they wanted me to learn her job, that they thought that she was going to be retiring in a few years, and her job was such that it was going to be hard to take over, so they wanted me to learn her position. And so I started, doing that. And about that time, the church decided that they wanted to take the travel in-house. First they took the general authority travel, and then they moved the missionary travel over there. And so I was given a choice: do you want to stay working for Murdoch Travel, or do you want to work for the church? And I decided that I would rather work for the church. which was a good thing, because about that time the travel agency just kind of went down the tubes because the airlines quit paying commissions. So it was a good move on my behalf. But eventually this woman retired, and I became an area manager over, let's see, it was Mexico. I was responsible for other agents working in Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, all the islands in the Pacific. Not the Philippines. I wasn't responsible for the Philippines. But anyway, we were responsible for not only the travel, but for the visas as well, for the missionaries getting visas going, and then we'd have missionaries from other countries coming to the United States. And it was one of my jobs was to make sure that those people outside the United States could legally come into Utah. But I worked closely with the attorneys that the church works with for immigration. So I did that, and then as well as I usually worked doing the missionaries and mission presidents going and coming, just that type of thing, getting their visas ready for them to go out. And sometimes the countries were slow and you couldn't get a visa, and then the missionaries would have to go into temporary missions for a while. But it was really an interesting job, and every once in a while I'd get a phone call from somebody I knew. I know Everett Perry called me once, and he didn't know he was calling me, but I just asked him, "Are you the same Everett Perry that lived in Carey, Idaho?" and there were other people. There was a fellow that lived up in Haley that was one of the New Zealand mission presidents, and I recognized his name right off the bat because all the girls had crushes on him, me included. And it was fun to talk to him. I let him know who I was, when the church they took my desktop computer and made it into an airline terminal. And I would get phone calls in the middle of the night from people in Australia and all over the world, One time I got a phone call from a mission president, and he was asking me to do something. And I said, "President, could you hold on just a minute? I've got some pies to take out of the oven." And he said, "Oh, it's Thanksgiving there, isn't it?" He says, "I just forgot." But we had to be able to take care of missionaries in emergency situations, and I'd bring back missionaries who had been hurt or some cases killed. Sometimes senior missionaries would get out in the field, and maybe one of them would have a heart attack or something like that, and I'd be responsible for bringing some of those people back. And anyway, it was quite an operation, and but it was very stressful at the same time. I told my husband, I said, "I think I'm like a doctor, I'm always on call." But in 2003, I had lung cancer, and I got over it okay, but I just felt like I wasn't up to par. I just was having a hard time doing things, and so I retired in 2005.
After I retired, Dell and I served 2 service missions. One was employment services, and the other one was addiction recovery, in which a lot of our time was spent out at the Utah State Prison.
And my husband passed away in 2013, and so I moved to Linden, Utah, so I could be closer to my son, and I've been here ever since. No, absolutely not. And I would really recommend that students, and I know it's hard to give people this kind of advice because most kids don't want to take it, but if I'd had some preparation that I had really worked at before I left school, well, or even if I had been urged to go to college. Now, it wasn't that my teachers didn't want me to go on and go to college, but I don't remember my folks ever talking about it. But my other friends did. My other friends went to college, girls and boys. But had somebody else been in the same position I was after Lee was killed, I had nothing to turn to. If I hadn't have been so fortunate that the military helped me out so much financially as well as a lot of other things, I don't know what I would have done because I had no training. And I really think that if young people could get some type of education, whether it's college or trade schools or whatever, not all people are cut out to go to a university, but there's a lot of really handy people who do really well from trade schools. And if somebody's got a talent for any of those things, if they would just build on that, so that if they can get in a position like I was, with 2 children and no education, it would just save a lot of heartache, heartburn, stress. And also, you had asked about people who inspire me. And basically, it's people who do good things. There's been a man that has lived in this area, and he looks like Santa Claus. He's not really an old man, but he's got this white beard, and he will go to all the homeless places. He drives a red Mustang that's his license plate says ho 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 on it. But he goes to all these little children, adults, and he just does so much good. Just so much good. He's one of them. He's the first one that ever comes to my mind when I think about things like that. But there are so many school teachers, that really, really can inspire young people to extend themselves and to build on what they probably already have. Not everybody's going to be a physicist when they leave Carey High School, but they need to have somebody that has faith in them, would support them, through good things and not so good of things. Everybody's going to have their ups and downs, but, well, like everybody else, I'm proud of my family. My kids, my boys especially, have done just really well. I can't leave my girls out either when it comes right down to it, but in different ways, you know, they've accomplished things in different ways. And I don't know, I think if anybody would have told me that I could accomplish what I did working, I would never have dreamed that I had that much responsibility and lived to tell the tale. I'm June Taylor Payne Faddis, and I graduated from Carey High School in 1959.